I would like to introduce my dear friend, Beth Swanson. Beth is the CEO of A Better Chicago. She's also vice chair of Chicago City Colleges. Beth was formerly the Deputy for Education for Mayor Rahm Emanuel and director before that of the Office of Management and Budget at Chicago Public Schools. Please note that you can submit questions into the Q&A, and with that, I will hand it over to Beth.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Deborah, and for that introduction, and thank you for having us. Today, we will talk about reimagining Black and Latinx student achievement and economic success. We know that equity and efficiency may be viewed as competing goals, and while creating fair policy is a value we all ascribe to, what is fair may not be economically efficient, and conversely, what is efficient may not be fair. The issue of Black and Latinx student achievement and economic mobility is often caught at these important intersections. And at A Better Chicago, the venture philanthropy I lead, we've seen our nonprofit grantees who serve thousands of students from these communities innovate in impressive ways to ensure that Black and Latinx youth are supported holistically. But we also know this work needs to move beyond their reach and for systems change to ensure Black and Latinx student success. So this conversation is an opportunity for us to generate ideas, reimagine student success, and specifically at the community college level. So joining me today to help us explore this further, we have three national leaders on this issue. John B. King Jr., former Secretary of Education in the Obama administration, then had been serving as CEO of the Education Trust until recently announced that he is running for governor in the great state of Maryland. We also have Austan Goolsbee, economist and professor at the University of Chicago Booth School, and Juan Salgado, the Chancellor of the City Colleges of Chicago, which is the community college system here in Chicago. So thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be engaging in conversation for the first part of the session. Please feel free to ask any questions in the chat, and we'll address those towards the end of the session. So with that, there are a lot of systemic and institutional factors that create inequities in the success rates of Black and Latinx students when compared to their white counterparts. And so, John, I'd like to start with you. And from your work at the state and national level, could you outline some of the major drivers of that discrepancy? What are some of the systemic and institutional factors that really contributed to this?
Sure. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this great conversation, Beth. Look, we have to start with the challenges in our K-12 system, really even going back to early childhood. The fact is, as a country, we give the least to the kids who need the most. So students of color are less likely to get access to quality early childhood education, less likely to get access to the strongest teachers. The schools that serve students of color are funded nationally at a level below the level of funding for schools that serve largely white students. There's a roughly $23 billion gap in spending between those schools that are serving white students versus those schools that are serving largely students of color. So we have all those challenges in our K-12 system. We see that play out with lower graduation rates for students of color, less access to advanced coursework opportunities like AP and International Baccalaureate. So we have those K-12 gaps. Then students get to college. And around college, we have several challenges. One, an affordability challenge. Because of our history as a country around race, dating back to the institution of slavery, the impact of segregation, we have a substantial racial wealth gap. And so students of color have less resources to tap for going to college. We have a racial income gap as well. And so their parents are less able to help them with college. And when you think about the colleges that are disproportionately attended by students of color, they too are under-resourced. Our community colleges, our minority serving institutions typically have less resources. They are less likely to have an endowment. They are getting a lower level of funding from their states. So here you have students with less access to preparation, less access to support once they're in college. And as a result, you see these attainment gaps. But as we say at EdTrust, these attainment gaps are really opportunity gaps. They're a reflection of the investments we have or have not made as a country. and we can close those opportunity gaps, and that will yield better attainment outcomes.
So with that, and thinking about the opportunity gaps, we've heard a great deal about, actually even in the last couple of weeks, with the issue of affordability and Biden administration proposing free community college, expansion of Pell, and trying to increase opportunity, as you note. Can you tell us a bit more about why, John, those policies would be so effective, particularly for Black and Brown students?
Well, it's hugely important. I will say it. I'm so encouraged to see these initiatives from the Biden administration. It's worth putting this in a little bit of historical context. The Pell Grant program is the primary federal funding source to support low-income students in pursuing higher education. In 1980, Pell Grants accounted for nearly 80% of the cost of attending a public college. Today, it's more like 28%. And alongside that diminished purchasing power of the Pell Grant, we've seen states systematically disinvesting from public higher education over the last several decades. So that's the landscape into which the Biden administration enters. And they have wisely done a few things. With the American Rescue Plan, put significant resources towards helping current college students stay in school. That was critically important. But now with the American Family Plan, there's now a proposal to create a federal-state partnership that would help make community college tuition free. That's a hugely important step. We're excited about that. And they would invest significant resources in student support strategies. So wraparound services, evidence-based strategies for helping students not just start college, but finish. That's hugely helpful. They also have proposed a significant increase in the Pell Grant program. That will be important for community college students as well as students attending four-year institutions. Remember that the total cost of attendance isn't just tuition. Of course, it's all the other things. It's housing, it's food, it's books, it's fees, it's childcare for the 1 in 5 college students who have children. So the Pell Grant program increase is really important, even alongside that free tuition for community college. The administration has also committed significant resources to HBCUs and minority serving institutions. That's very important because those are real engines of social mobility in our society. So as a package, what the Biden administration has proposed, I think would be a substantial step forward. We have to make sure there's the political will to actually implement that agenda, and that will require, of course, support in Congress.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Austan, I want to move sort of more broadly, like thinking about support. Does debt or loan forgiveness make good economic sense? How does that lead to fueling our workforce and economy?
It can, I guess I would say. If you start getting into the weeds of debt forgiveness, you will run across a couple of factors that complicate it. One being the largest debts are actually for professional schools, tend to be for professional schools like business schools, medical schools, law schools. And those are not the hardest hit students because they tend to have bigger debts, but also higher incomes that they pay off the debts. If you look at enrollments during this COVID recession, it looks completely different from any previous recession in the United States in a worrying way, which is normally one of the only bright sides to a downturn is the demand for education goes up. So a bunch of people say, well, if it's hard to get a job at this moment, I'm going to go upgrade my skill set. And then when the economy kicks back in, I'll have higher income. This is the first recession that we've ever had where enrollment in community college went down precipitously, partly because people couldn't afford it, partly because you couldn't physically go to community college and online training was perceived to not be as good. So with that as the backdrop, I think that the trying to get the tuition to be cheap, to not just be, even if it's going to be free, to not make it so that you have to wait until April of next year when you file your taxes to get the payment. investing in wraparound services, and I would say targeted debt forgiveness to the groups that would be hard hit. All of those, I think, could be important components of rebuilding the workforce skill base after an experience like the one we just had.
Yeah, and Juan, I know, you're living this daily, leading city colleges, and are attacking this issue headlong, not only enrollment, but you've put in a number of different mechanisms, which I'd love to hear more about, just support CCC students, particularly around affordability and scholarships. And if you could tell us a bit about that work, that would be great.
Well, happy to. And I think when we think about, let me start with debt forgiveness, actually, because that's where Austan ended. We rolled out a debt forgiveness program called the Fresh Start Debt Forgiveness Program. And what's different about this is what Austan said, targeted. Because the one population of students we absolutely need to work on debt forgiveness are those that have some college, no degree, and debt. Okay, let's just start there. Let's clear the debt for those students with some college, no degree, and debt. And all of a sudden, you've opened up the opportunity for them to enter into and complete their post-secondary education. That's low-hanging fruit of assets that we have out in society that can do more in driving our economy forward. And that's what we did. We said to any student in the last 10 years that if you had debt with us, it will be forgiven. Just come back, get your degree, we're done with it, right? And we believe that every institution of higher education should do that. Why? Because they're not going to collect this money anyway. Let's be real, right? And we need that money in the pockets of our students so that they can afford their education. The second thing we're doing is ensuring that we have the proper supports for our students. For a long time now, we've been operating the Chicago Star Scholarship, merit-based scholarship, get a B average, community college is completely free to you, no cost whatsoever. And what have we seen? We've seen graduation rates that are double what the average is within our institution, just as a result of guaranteeing the student that we will be there financially, right? And don't think for a minute a B average means that we've got these, students that are all college ready. Oftentimes you can get a B average and yet still be taking developmental education or struggling in college, right? And so these students are performing because they have the financial supports. But we've got to go even further. We've got to look at pathways where we need to either diversify or create demand, and we have to incentivize students to be successful in that pathway. I'm going to give you one, which is teachers, right? We are at a shortage of qualified teachers in our classroom, particularly Black and Brown teachers. And so what we just launched a week ago is a SEED scholarship, which provides any student that wants to get into the teaching pathway from Chicago Public Schools a $3,000 per year scholarship that is refundable, meaning if you're a Pell student, you get your full Pell amount that pays your tuition, leaves you a little money in your pocket, and you get this $3,000, right? Because you're on a teaching pathway, and we're going to ensure that you have the resources that you need to stay on track along with the supports. And so these are the kinds of things that we're doing, not just in teaching, but in IT and other fields where we understand and know that we have students that can succeed, but we have pipelines that need to be built and grown.
Yeah, absolutely. Austan, I guess I want to switch a little bit from the demand side of this equation around the debt forgiveness, free tuition, but you also argue we need to focus on the supply side of this issue. And I know you're part of the Aspen Economic Strategy Group. Earlier this year, proposed two-part policy with the goal of supporting 30 million more American workers. If you could tell us a little bit more about that work and those policy recommendations.
Yeah, sure. It was a bipartisan / nonpartisan effort. I was joined by the Republican Glenn Hubbard, who was the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors under George Bush, plus people like Penny Pritzker and others. And we observed that there's a lot of effort on the part of analysts of the labor force, let's call it, to dream up new institutions for how can we better prepare the workforce for the future. And what we observed is the unsung hero of the training of the American workforce is the community college system. And it's low cost to the student. It's efficiently run on average. It already exists, so you don't have the delays to get them started. And so we emphasize how important it has been, that system has been for development of the workforce, and that money to help tuition and make college affordable is important. But if all you do is give money to the demand side, you run a risk that the institutions are not strong enough to be able to handle it. That in a sense, you'll drive the prices up because there are a fixed number of spots. And so you have already seen that the community college, which is very affordable and has a high bang for the buck, they don't have the resources to have slots available. And when they don't, and when they are kind of starved for resources, as we started the discussion that you've seen really in almost all states, them squeezing the resources going to higher education, because it's one of the only discretionary things in the state budget, that it's driving more people into the for-profit sector. And if you look at the for-profit sector, it looks a lot worse than the community college sector does. That is, the outcomes are worse. The tuition is 3-4 times higher. The default rate on student loans in the for-profit sector is orders of magnitude higher than in community colleges. So our argument fundamentally was, you've got to take some money to build up the institutions to absorb all the people that you're trying to encourage to go get schooling. And I will say, at least in the short run, the rescue program does provide funding to institutions of kind of the form that we were outlining. So hopefully that can serve as a model going forward.
Yeah, Juan, thinking of the population here at city colleges, would that work sort of contextually, or does the policy avoid penalizing institutions with greater numbers of economically disadvantaged students?
What I love about the proposal that Austan and his colleagues worked on here is that it had these two elements. It had the element of providing the institutional support, but also holding institutions accountable for results. And in the institutional support, it was weighted towards institutions that have higher needs students, right? So you think about your homeless students, right? And we have 15% of our students surveyed before the pandemic were homeless in the last 30 days. We had over 54% that were housing insecure in the prior 30 days before the survey, and also food insecure, right? And so if you're a community college with large proportions of those kinds of students, it comes to reason. And we're talking about the diverse learners that are coming from, having IEPs in high school to being able to be successful in college with the right supports. And so how do you create a system that recognizes that those learners will require, additional supports while holding us accountable for ensuring that we are in fact getting the requisite results for that investment? And so I thought that the proposal that the Aspen Economic Strategy group put together really afforded us the opportunity to make sure that we were addressing equity, because at the end of the day, that's what equity looks like. It looks like sending resources to ensure better outcomes for students that require those resources in order to be just as successful as any other student.
Yeah, absolutely. We know these structural inequities, as you say, existed well before COVID-19 pandemic. And we also know the inequities have been magnified, obviously, in the past year in this crisis and been brought to light for all. National research is now showing unprecedented challenges for Black and Latinx low-income students, pre-K through college. The need for additional learning, social emotional supports, essential needs supports. And that's something, we are working on at Better Chicago in our everyday work. And John, you mentioned that at the beginning of the, just thinking about the systemic, issues facing us, how can policymakers, systems leaders sort of leverage this moment to really transform our higher education system so it can actually work for all?
Yeah. Well, look, we have to acknowledge that what we had before was not working, and that it is not good enough to go back to February 2020, that we actually really do need to significantly transform our systems to meet our current needs. And I think about that on three levels. One, all the systems of support that we need around low-income folks so they can access opportunity. So I think about the importance of the child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan that has the potential to cut child poverty in half. The families that benefit from the child tax credit, that's a lot of students of Juan's that are going to benefit from that child tax credit change. We've got to make that permanent, right? We've got to think about how we address the supply of affordable housing. We've got to think about how we ensure that folks can access meals. So there's the societal work that we need to do that will help create the foundation for folks to access educational opportunity. Then there's education investments. Again, this federal-state partnership envisioned by the Biden administration, I think, is the right direction. We have to make sure that if we focus on the total cost of attendance, I think about the Washington State College Grant Program, which was the only College Promise program that met our EdTrust criteria for equity because they were not just focused on tuition, they were addressing all those non-tuition costs, and they were intentional about building in wraparound supports, and they got their business community to invest in the program so they actually fund what they promise. But I would argue that even if we did all those things, and those are a tall order, we still need an effort to better align what students are doing day to day in higher ed with the needs of our current workforce. And I know this is something that Juan is focused on quite a bit, but we still have too many students who, even with college credits, even with an associate's degree, actually aren't seeing the real economic benefit in their lives because it's not well matched to the demands of the current economy. So we really do need an innovation agenda that's about partnering employers and higher ed institutions to design programs that prepare people for high demand jobs, renewable energy, cybersecurity, many of the new jobs that will be created by the infrastructure investments the Biden administration envisions. And then we have to build better feedback loops so that the faculty are hearing from employers, are students able to demonstrate the knowledge and skills necessary to succeed in the workplace? And then there has to be an incentive to tweak programs, to change them, to make sure that they match employer demand. And I think we've been slow as a country to do that work, to our detriment, because we're not just competing within the United States, we're competing with the world. And if we want to win the 21st century, we really have to better align higher education with where the jobs are growing in our economy.
Yeah, absolutely. An EdTrust report recently had a quote from a student that stuck with me. It is about the way schools are structured now and the way education is structured. It's not set up for students to succeed. It's not, set up to get into the high demand industries, et cetera. And Juan, I know that has been a huge priority of yours, and you talked a little bit about the teaching pathway, but you could talk a little bit more about how this plays out and some of the other emerging industries that you're aligning with and making sure that there are tangible pathways for the students of Chicago.
Yeah, so I think it does require, as John talked about, a reorganization, and we've been undergoing that reorganization at City Colleges of Chicago, understanding that at the end of the day, the value that we need to provide is ensuring that that student that is graduating is finding themselves in the career of their interest, and the employer is finding, that person that's ready for their environment. And so what we've had to do is invite business and industry in to look at our curriculum. Companies like Accenture and Aon and others within our environment, manufacturing companies and logistics companies. So we picked the areas of high growth in the Chicago economy where there's large demand. And we went to these companies and we said, look at our curriculum first. And let's make sure that we are aligned to your needs. And then the second thing we said is take our students as interns, take our students as apprentices. As a result of taking our students, that feedback loop gets built. And the third thing we said is you don't have to wait for them to have a bachelor's degree to take them. In fact, what you want to do in some instances is look at the universe of jobs that you have available. And if you can bring somebody in while they're earning their associate's degree on their journey to earn their bachelor's degree, and you can actually help expose them to the environment and help them to finish that degree. There's a sticker shock for an associate degree earner when they go from our environment to a four-year environment. Companies can help them on that process by bringing them into their company in a value-added way. And what we've discovered, and by the way, we just celebrated with the Chicago Apprenticeship Network last week, 1,000 apprentices, right? In non-traditional fields. We're talking about IT and human resources and cybersecurity and financial services, a wide range of fields where our students have been able to step into occupations, provide incredible value, where the companies have grown the number of associate's degree candidates and recipients in their programs. And mind you, these were all companies where they had as a requirement a four-year degree to be able to get in the door. That is no longer. And so a big part of what's required is not just education restructuring, which we need to do, but it's also the businesses changing their practices in order to get the right kind of talent that they need.
There's two things Juan just said that were super important as he was laying out those that I would call attention to. The first is the both importance of and willingness of community colleges to work with the private sector. They want to work with the private sector. The private sector wants to work with them. In the job market of today, where people do not tend to go to one company and stay there their whole life, the old model of you got your training from the firm that you worked for your entire career doesn't work anymore, because the last thing one company wants to do is spend all the money to train a person and then the person just leave and go to their competitor company. So that opened the door to working with community colleges to get this kind of skills training they need. And the second is, if you would not know it listening to the political fights in Washington, but my experience has been that when asked for, let's call it accountability, if we're going to give community colleges resources, then we want them to be held accountable for performance, for what students are getting the money, et cetera. Most community colleges are totally willing to be held accountable. They want to show their results. They want to be as effective as possible. And they absolutely say, give us resources. We are 100% willing to do programs that are documented to be good programs that the private sector in our areas actively want to work with us to develop.
Fantastic. We're getting lots of questions. So I'm going to in the chat. So one more thing on this, Austan, just to follow up. As we think about building out these sort of pathways or connections to corporate America. Are there other systems or dollars we could work creatively to really leverage? I'm thinking, in all the essential needs too, the housing, food, cash assistance, I'm thinking dollars flowing through the labor department. Is there something we can be doing here that is just not all focused on the education sort of spend
I think focused on the education narrowly defined, I think yes. And John's has seen a lot of this research, as has Juan. From what I've seen, extremely high bang for the buck on money spent on the so-called wraparound services. Just simple advising, academic advising, and life skills, executive type advising, making clear things like, hey, look, you've already taken 5 classes. If you would take 2 more, you actually would qualify for an X certificate, which would allow you to get a higher job. And you didn't realize that, but here's how you could do it. Simple advising can be quite effective. The second, this thing that I described of just the timing of payments can also be quite important. So we have tended to have a system in which in Washington, they decide, let's give a tax credit for that. And then that means you can't really get the money until next April when you file your taxes. And that doesn't work with the tuition structure. So any ways that we can set up that payments can go directly to the institutions, those can also have a big impact.
Can I add a couple of things to that, Beth? I agree with Austin completely. And I would just note that the CUNY ASAP program, which has been shown in randomized controlled trials to double college completion for community college students, has the advising that Austin described, also has free Metro cards, which in New York City is like gold, right? Because it takes the transportation costs out of the equation. And they also have these emergency grants. So just-in-time financial assistance when folks get into a crisis, if they have to move suddenly, if their car breaks down, that $200, $500 can be the difference between staying in school or not. CUNY ASAP builds that in. CUNY ASAP was replicated in Ohio with gas cards instead of Metro cards, and again, doubled community college completion rates. The other thing I'd say, the advising also has to be around the what's next as well. And there's a real opportunity for community colleges to get better at supporting students as they figure out the internship, the alignment between their coursework and potential jobs, navigating the job market. And the challenge for community college has been because they don't have the resources, they don't have the staffing. I mean, think about this in this country. You go to an elite university, and their career service office is packed with people buzzing about to help their already affluent students find the best job in investment banking. Meanwhile, down the road in the community college, folks are entering the job market with inadequate support. And so we have our priorities backwards sometimes as a society.
Yeah. John's right. I just jump in on this. John's absolutely right. I mean, at city colleges, we provide the transportation pass. We've got our wellness centers. We've got an emergency fund. We're putting our resources so our students can get through, but we equally have an underdeveloped career services unit. Right now I'm hard pressed to figure out where am I going to get the resources to build out the career services that my students merit.
I am getting a bunch of questions. I'm going to start to switch to audience questions for the panel, and some are around the sort of, this systemic inequities piece. And one was just around the national average. And if you all, and John, perhaps this is best thrown to you first, but figures on the national average of K-12 per capita spending for students of color versus white students. Are we making progress? Not only K-12, but again, I think we've talked a little bit about the higher ed financing, but, how are we going to get at that issue?
We've got about little under $2,000 per student gap between the spending in the districts that have the fewest students of color versus those that have the largest numbers of students of color. So we're spending more in the districts that are serving our whiter student populations. I will say that there has been progress in states that have committed to school funding reform. But oftentimes what happens is states commit to school funding reform. They say they're going to direct more resources to their highest needs districts, and then they run into financial challenges. And the first thing to go is the plan to provide additional funding to their highest needs districts. Now, the Biden administration has proposed very substantial increases to Title I, which is the primary federal source of funding for our highest needs districts. That would be hugely helpful. But of course, we have to think not only about how much, but how well, and make sure that the use of the dollars is for things that have a strong evidence base. So we think about the impact of COVID. We have students all over the country who've missed months and months of in-person instruction, and online instruction just isn't as good on average for students. And so we can expect, from a study recently by McKinsey, we could expect for low-income students and students of color 6 to 12 months of learning loss. But we have really good evidence that intensive targeted tutoring can help make up that ground. So hopefully, the $130 billion for K-12 in the American Rescue Plan, the proposed significant increase of Title I, hopefully those dollars can be turned to intensive targeted tutoring because we have an evidence base. That'll really be the test, I think, for K-12. How do we make sure that these new dollars are deployed as effectively as possible?
I think there's a number of questions around the student supports necessary, and one caution from a rural community college faculty member of just saying, even with free education and free laptops and just not having a car to be able to physically drive to campus, like, is just just to acknowledge just how many obstacles there truly are to this, but also others acknowledging that free will hopefully drive additional enrollment, et cetera. Can community colleges support, assuming an influx of enrollment or even a crush of students that free college might entail? Could our community's college system really be prepared and ready for that intake and have high quality education ready to go?
I would just add one thing, that is the spirit in which we said it's important to also strengthen the institutions. But the thing to remember is that for a lot of community college students, tuition was already free. If you counted Pell Grants, if you went through, the problem wasn't getting the tuition down. So I actually don't think that moving to free tuition is, in a way, a silver bullet that will lead to a massive expansion of student demand. I think some of these other, putting money in some of these other spaces and bringing people who have dropped out back into the system, that will be more of an increase in demand. But I do think we can handle the demand. If anything, it has been the cutbacks at the state level restricting the capacity, which has led us into the problems. If we would just kind of go back to where we were not that long ago in terms of the level of support by the states, I don't think that we would be in a too bad of a situation.
And I'll just add, I think clearly the community colleges have capacity. We know what needs to be done. We know that when we have the proper advisors, when we have the embedded tutoring, when we have wellness supports are huge. They were huge before the pandemic. They are today. We know that when we provide emergency funds and transportation assistance, right, we're just helping students complete our grants. When you're that close to finishing, you just got to make sure that you finish. And we've got to put down the resources so that can happen. So we know there's enough evidence and evidence-based practices, and there's a community college community that has been on a learning journey together. So we're adopting practices that are increasingly more common across the country. That's a good thing. We are ready for this. If you have the proper supports. And I agree with Austan, it's for the population that we need to support better, the free community college, what I hope it can do, right, is ensure that we're properly resourced to support these students in a way that helps them to complete. And this is a big issue, right? And this is the biggest challenge for community college in this entire program. We must do better in getting students to the finish line. And if we're properly resourced, then we must deliver.
A couple of more questions around sort of systemic barriers to economic advancement, but and a couple of pieces of information to offer. But we know, and research tells, that Black Americans who have advanced degrees in education, graduate degrees, accumulate $200,000 less in net worth than the average white family, or that average Black employee with a college degree still earns less than the average white high school graduate. There's a question around that do you think the current systems can really offer true equity to all learners? If so, why isn't it happening? If not, what does that new system look like? So if you had the magic wand, and maybe it's pay for all of these, essential needs and just remove those barriers. But John, I'll start with you on that one.
Yeah, look, I mean, let's acknowledge this whole conversation happens in the context of systemic racism, and systemic racism affects not only education, but our job market. A couple observations. One is, I think we have to be very intentional about the access to advising and career advising in ways that help students who are students of color, students from low-income families, first-generation students, immigrant students, get access to the best jobs. If you look at which students are in which programs, and you see this as early as career tech ed programs in high school, all the way through community college programs into our four-year institutions. Systematically, we see more white students and more affluent students in the programs that are tied to the most financially rewarding opportunities. That's a problem. We have to make sure that our advising helps steer students to where the opportunities are. We have to make sure that our faculty members and our advisors are diverse themselves, right? And the fact is, higher ed has not done a good enough job around diversity. We have to think about that, particularly when we're talking about transfer, right? So there are a lot of students that one has who their reason for being in community college is they ultimately want to be in a four-year institution. But when you look at the public four-year institutions in Illinois, they systematically under-enroll Black and Latino students. And so, a lot of people put out these statements last summer saying that they believe Black Lives Matter. A lot of universities said we care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. I want to see that rhetoric turn to reality in who they enroll, who their faculty members are, who their administrators are, and the kind of campus climate they create that should be welcoming to, for example, community college transfer students who are significantly more diverse in many cases than their regular population.
Some questions revolving around, again, the link to jobs and credentials. So one question is, how do we expose sort of the myth of the stackable credential and build authentic linkages between certifications prior to the associate's degree? In a follow-up, how can we incentivize employers to really be a part of that student progress along pathways? And I know, Juan, you have some specific examples of that, but those are the two. Yeah.
Well, look, all this just needs to be embedded, right? Whether it's the certification, the actual, credits. By the way, when we're talking about that population of students that is already out there working, many of whom have some college already, you start to take the credits that they've already earned, they take the experience that they already have, you start to embed that with these industry certifications, and you make sure that these things work together in a way that truly supports students. And that's part of the puzzle that's not coming together as quickly and as well as we need it to be to meet both student need as well as the employer demand. And so we're going to have to get better at that. But I also don't think that you want a whole bunch of industry certifications that sit outside the system of higher education, because at that point, you're limiting the possibilities of that learner for the future. We need to embed these things so that the learner has both the opportunity to go get that certification, but also the opportunity to go all the way through post-secondary. Let's not forget that in the last economic crisis, the one that Austan and John steered us through with many of their colleagues that brought us to where we were pre-pandemic, look, the number of jobs for people with a bachelor's degree was strong throughout that crisis and increased tremendously as we recovered. And we tend to forget that right now. And I think, yes, this economy is going to shift, but is it really going to shift that much? You know, at the end of the day, I don't want our students to be left out. I want them to have both and I want to be very careful, and employers should be very careful that we're not limiting the possibilities of our students.
What about suggestions for private companies to partner with state programs or initiatives, sort of regional, larger, to make really long-term difference sort of on mass scale? So, obviously embed course by course, community college by community, but is there a way to do this, incentivize companies and plug in at a even larger systems or regional level?
In a way that kind of hits us in our weak spot, which is our system is so oriented around state level determinations of policies, state level funding, et cetera, that regions like ours that span a couple of state borders, it would be better if we could have some regional compacts. I know that our employers would be open to that, but I just think institutionally it's somewhat hard. I mean, John, you must have thought about that in a serious way.
Yeah, I mean, a couple observations. One is, I think employers who really want to partner effectively with their state higher ed institutions need to commit to the work of making transparent what are the knowledge and skills that are needed for employee success. And sometimes that requires some real analytic work to think about, well, we know we need coders, but what exactly do we mean by that? What level of skill? What should that look like? What should the course requirements be? That conversation hasn't, I think, happened even regionally as much as it should. One exception to that would be the PTech programs, which are partnerships. They're all around the country now. The original partnership was between New York City DOE, IBM, and the City University of New York. And they really built the high school curriculum as well as the associate's degree curriculum in conjunction with IBM engineers, thinking about what are the skills that entry-level employees at IBM need. And then that PTech program has been replicated around the country, but it isn't at the, I agree with Austan, this is a weak point for us. It's not at the scale we need. The other thing I would say is employers, if they're serious about diversifying their workforce, need to commit to internship programs, and that requires resources. That requires staff who are going to support those interns, train those interns, give them feedback, give feedback to the institution where those interns came from. And that requires a commitment. And in some cases, that's hard, especially for small businesses, but maybe, through chambers and in other ways, they might be able to collaborate together to create those strong internship programs. I think about the work that Urban Alliance does, beginning in high school, getting students matched with employer partners, training employer partners on how to support high school students for success in those internships. We have to get a lot better if we're serious about making sure we have the workforce we need to win the 21st century. We have to get serious about collaboration across sectors.
I guess the way I'd say it is, there's definitely a problem of take a the employers in Indiana, would they be working with community college in Michigan or in Illinois to train workers in a different state? That is a kind of a weakness. But if you take a step back, yes, that's a weakness, but that's not the main problem of what's happening in the system now. The main problem of the system now is, if you look at the salary benefit of going to community college, getting an associate's degree versus not having it, it's never been larger. It kind of goes to Juan's point that over the last 20 years, the returns to education have risen and they've literally never been higher. So the demand has never been greater. You would think that we'd be expanding, building out community colleges. States would be investing in that when the benefit is the greatest, and it's been the opposite. They've never been more starved for resources than they are now. That's the first order problem, not the cross-state problem.
So there's PTEC just jogged a couple other questions in the chat around just sort of the collaborations between the K-12 and community college system and successful models, and that is one, obviously, and Chicago adapted that PTEC model and has a number of schools functioning in that way now. But are there other examples of partnerships, whether it's Chicago or other places throughout the country, of strategies of bringing those systems together to really help advance performance of Black and Brown students?
Well, let me just give you the Chicago example. We've built in Chicago what we call the Chicago Roadmap between the Chicago Public Schools and City Colleges of Chicago. It's basically a joint strategy that looks at how we can drive greater value to our students. We've identified some game-changing things that we can do to really increase student enrollment, persistence, and completion from Chicago Public Schools to and through our programs. And so I do think that in order for us to drive this value that Austan is talking about, this regional value, this local value to the marketplace, we have to be a lot more synchronous within our institutions. And so Chicago Public Schools and city colleges, we're not approaching employers separately. We're providing them a value proposition that is together, right? That is going to produce more and more students. And I think one of the missing links is for us to have that sort of regional approach, we need to bring our universities in to this partnership. And that's a little harder because they are, they're islands unto themselves in many respects. And so we need them to work more as a unit, right? Than they work now. And with the limited resources we have in community college and K through 12 districts, it's hard for us to harness fully what the 4 years could do as we approach together the employer community. I think that's a big missing link. But the K through 12 city colleges, we're doing that right now.
Yeah, just to add, I think what's promising about the PTEC model is you say to students at the outset, you're going to leave here high school diploma, associate's degree, first in line for a job at IBM or the other employer partners with which they're working. That clarity is really powerful. Massachusetts has been doing a lot of work around early college, high school programs, again, where they're very intentional in saying to students, you're part of this early college, high school community. When you leave this high school, you will leave with your first year or two of college credits already in hand, and that will help make college more affordable for you. And then they're able to build a culture around it. But I will say the evidence nationally is that dual enrollment generally is a good thing, that if you can get high school students into college courses, it does help lift their aspirations around college. I was impressed that Northern Virginia Community College last summer, they used their CARES Act dollars to say, we're going to offer free community college courses to any high school junior or senior in our region. And they chose 5 classes that were high interest, including one on cloud networks, so that they could help get students excited about the kind of pathway that might lead to a job at a place like Amazon, which has its headquarters now in Northern Virginia. And they both created an opportunity for high school students, and they created some folks who are now going to enroll in Northern Virginia Community College because of that experience. So given what we've learned about online learning, I think we could get a lot more creative about opportunities to bridge higher ed, K-12, and employer relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this moment in time really allows, I think, for that type of thinking, John. And if there's any moment to try to innovate and think about, you know, the education systems that should be, not what was, it is right now. And sort of shame on us if we don't all figure out how to lean into this moment and do what's best for our young people. So I know we've got just a few, or actually less than a minute left. So I am going to thank everyone who joined us today for this conversation. And also thank you to the esteemed panel we had today, just sharing your time and expertise and ideas. And just thank you for your continued leadership on these critical issues. And I hope we can all see each other soon in person, perhaps at the ASU GSB coming up. So thanks again and have a great day.
Get your vaccine.
Amen to that. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, guys.